Hello, I'm Tony Goldstone, and in this model we're going to go through one of the basic tabs, which is the step 1 or minimum data set. And in many ways this is the most important tab of the whole model, and that's because, like any model, it's absolutely crucially dependent on the information that you put into the model, and any inaccuracies that are put in on this initial step will obviously be carried through to the calculations in all of the subsequent models. So I'm going to click through to step 1 by clicking on this hyperlink, and this takes me through to the minimum data set. And the minimum data set is split into two areas. We've got areas of mandatory input, and as the name suggests, these are mandatory, and this represents the absolute minimum data that you've got to put in to get any form of prediction of either pension or taxation. And then in the blue cells, you've got optional inputs, and these just help refine the model to give you even better predictions, particularly looking forward into the future. So I'm just going to go through each of the mandatory and optional inputs. So section A is about you and your pension. And at the very top of this, you need to select which legacy pension you're part of. Now, for most people, that will be the standard 1995 pension, but for people that took the 2008 pension either through choice or who joined the scheme after April 2007 and then were mandated to go into the 2008 section, you should select that in this drop down when that becomes available later in the year. It's also important to pick your nation currently, because this will determine the pay rises that are modelled in to the future, and I'll come on to that in a few minutes. So in this cell you need to put your exact date of birth, and the model will calculate your age, and the model will also calculate whether or not you're eligible to receive so-called transitional protection. So this was protection that is available to people of a certain age, that means that they weren't forcibly transferred over to the 2015 section, or indeed some people who were within 10 years of retirement when the changes were announced got full protection, and then they remained in the 1995 scheme right until the end. So by putting your date of birth in here, it would automatically tell you whether or not you have protection, and there's nothing you need to do about anything that's in these grey cells. So you can see for our model consultant here, who's around 40 years, he has no protection, which means that he will just be in the standard 2015 scheme from March 2015. So we then need to tell the model how much service we had in our legacy pension, and to do that we need a source document, and that source document can be one of two documents. If you're in England and Wales, you will have access to TRS or total reward statements, and you need a TRS from the year 2014/15 or later, because that's the year that most people transitioned. And if you're in Scotland or Northern Ireland, you need a document called the ABS or Annual Benefit Statement. And all of those documents should be available online on your pensions portal. So obviously you need to tell the model which document you're putting in data for. So ideally, if you have it, the best document to use for this is the 14/15 document, which will be called the 2015 TRS or the 2015 ABS. But if you need to use a later one, you can just select the year of the document that you're using. As I said previously, the earliest one that you can use for this step is 14/15. So in this example, our consultant in 14/15, it says that he had 14 years and 1 day of service. So you just put in the number of years and the number of days service. And it's important not to estimate this step. You need to give it the exact service to get a reasonable pension prediction. So the model also needs to know when you became a consultant. And it's not only important to tell it the year, but also the month of your appointment, or more specifically, the month that you increment. And that's because the annual allowance tax is very sensitive to pay rises. So, for example, if you increment in April, all of your annual increment would be within one tax year. So, at the moment, this consultant is a consultant in England. So let's just, for example, let's change that to Wales. And then if we scroll down here, we can see that this is the Welsh pay scale. And we can see that there are a number of pay awards paid at different times. And then these are reflected here within the future section. But you can see all of these awards are paid within a single tax year. And that's because this consultant increments in April. But if, for example, I change that to October or the 10th month, we can now see that these pay awards have been split equally into two pay rises. One pay rise reflecting October to March in the first bit, and then the remainder of the pay rise will be paid in the subsequent tax year. So that would have an annual allowance effect that would span 2 years. So it's very important to make sure that you put in the exact month that you increment. So I'm just going to change that back to England, and I'm going to change that back to April for the purposes of the model. So the next section is optional, and that relates to the purchase of additional years. So if we change that to yes, it defaults to no, we can see that some additional options appear. And for added years, you need to tell it the information that's in your added years contract. And that essentially says that you've got a start date and an end date. So this consultant has had an added years contract that would run over 30 years until age 60. And then you put in the number of added years purchased. So for example, let's say this consultant was purchasing 6 years over 30 years. That would give him 0.2 years per calendar year. And then finally, you need to tell the model the additional employee contribution that you're making to purchase those added years. So this example is from 30 to 60 for 6 added years, and he's paying 4.18%. Additionally, over the normal employee contribution, and you need to fill that in. But if you don't have added years, you just need to make sure that that cell is 0. You don't need to change any of the other additional cells, and just make sure that's selected to no, and they should fall off your radar. So this next cell talks about something called the cost cap mechanism. So every 4 years the pension scheme is valued, and then dependent on certain parameters they may make changes to contribution rate, such as the employee or employer contribution rate, but also to the amount that you accrue. And in the most recent valuation or cost cap mechanism, it was decided that rather than getting 1/54th every year in the 2015 scheme, we should be getting 1/48.1ths. But all of that is on hold because of the firefighters and judges litigation that's ongoing. So if you set this to 0, it will keep it as per the status quo, which is we're continuing to get 1/54ths. But should that change, and that will be backdated to 1st of April 2019, if you simply change that to a 1, that will change the value of accrual for you automatically. So this next optional cell is a target pension. And this is designed to allow you to set a value for a pension that you would hope to achieve in real terms today. So, for example, there was a recent survey on DNUK website that asked people what kind of pension they were hoping to achieve, and the most popular answers were between £40,000 and £60,000. So we've chosen the midpoint there at £50,000, because obviously if you're looking at the value of a pension that might be in 10, 20 or even 30 years time, that would need adjusting for inflation. So this just allows you to put in a value in today's money as to the sort of pension that you'd be hoping to achieve. This section is greyed out and it relates to transitional protection, and it will just tell you the point at which you transfer over should you be lucky enough to have transitional protection if that was afforded to you. And then this next question, it basically just says, do you want to have automatic pay progression as a consultant? So the choices are consultant, and if you choose consultant, it will allow you to use these values here. So this is the pay scale in England, because I've changed that back, and it will automatically put in these pay rises at the appropriate points in the future. But however, if you've had non-standard pay progression, you can just select that to turn off pay progression, and then all of those future values have been changed to 0, and then you can manually put in the pay rises at exactly the points that they occur. Now, this year of consultant appointment assumes that you go in on the bottom of the consultant pay scale. If, for example, you went in and you were given credit for 2 years in research or elsewhere, you could just take 2 years off that value to change that. But it's very important that you manually check that the points at which you get pay thresholds correspond to the point at which your employer confirms to you your next due your pay rise. Because as I said previously, it's crucially dependent for the annual allowance when you get pensionable pay rises. So the only other section of the spreadsheet that's been greyed out relates to the 2008 pension, but only if you came over in the choice section. And this section has a mandatory lump sum. And for this section, you need to tell the model what your mandatory lump sum was at the year that you've used for your source document. So, for example, here I've used the 14/15 TRS, and I've told it that that was my lump sum, and you should put the exact amount that appears in pounds and pence. And then that will calculate the years and days for your 2008 lump sum based on the values that you've used for which year of TRS and your pensionable pay for the year that you've put it in. So it's important that, so this example was 14/15. So if we go to the 14/15 tax year, that should be the value that appears on your TRS for pensionable pay for that tax year to correctly calculate the number of years and days that you have for the 2008 lump sum. And if you're using the 14/15 TRS because it was based on your pensionable service in March 2008, that value should generally be 7 years less than the amount of service that you had in 14/15. And that's why it's easier for you to use the 14/15 TRS if you still have that available. So I'm just going to click that back to 1995 section. And now we've completed the section A about you and your pension. I'm going to turn pay progression back on because I changed that as well. And now I'm going to move on to the next section, which is about the past. So the model needs an accurate position on your earnings of both pensionable pay, going back to 2011/12 pay year. And the reason it needs so many years is to accurately work out your annual allowance liability, including carry forward. And carry forward will be talked about in much more detail in other videos. But essentially, for the annual allowance, you can use unused allowance for the prior 3 tax years. But 3 previous tax years ago is dependent on 3 tax years prior to that. And therefore, to build up an accurate picture, you need a reasonable amount of history to ensure that you extract as much annual allowance as you're allowed to do so. So to be able to do that, you need to put in pensionable pay from 11/12 all the way through to 18/19, which was the most recent end of the tax year. And if you're a consultant in England and Wales, that's very easy to get from your total reward statements. And similarly in Scotland, that information is also on your pay slips. So I'm just going to go through to the model guide quickly. So you'll see that there's a link through to ESR, and if you're set up to receive ESR at home, you can do that at home, or alternatively you can do that on Trust Site with a smart card. And if you don't have access to ESR, you need to speak to your own Trust IT department to obtain that. But once you have that, the pay slips, certainly in England and Wales, look a little bit like this. And then if you use the March pay slip, that has a year-to-date balance. And then by doing the March pay slips for each year, where this red value is here, are the pensionable pays. And it's important to make sure that you use the correct year. So these are the tax years starting. I'll just go back to the spreadsheet actually. So this is the tax year starting, and then this is the pay slip year. So for this value here, we're going to use the March 19 pay slip for the 18/19 tax year. Similarly for this value here, it's the 17/18 tax year. So we're going to use the March 18 pay slip value. Now for consultants in Northern Ireland, it's a little bit more complicated because pensionable pay doesn't appear routinely on your pay slips. You can get the previous 2 years values from your annual benefit statements, but for pensionable pay prior to that, you'll need to speak to your pensions agency, who generally will give these values to you over the phone. So that is pensionable pay, but then from 2016/17, the model also needs to know your non-pensionable pay. And it needs to know your non-pensionable pay because of pensions tapering. So although one might logically think that pensions taxation relates only to your pension, since 2016/17 it also relates to your total pay, including non-pensionable pay. And that's why it's greyed out before that, because you don't need to put these values in because it didn't affect it prior to that tax year. But from 16/17 you need to put in this value. Now there's a little discussion about this in the model itself. If you are relatively straightforward and only have income within the NHS, you can work out your non-pensionable pay by taking your year-to-date taxable pay, by adding back in your employee contribution, which will give you your gross pay, and then taking away that previous value, which is your non-pensionable pay, your pensionable pay, and that will equate to your non-pensionable pay. Alternatively, you can work it out manually from the elements of pay which aren't pensionable. So, for example, additional PAs or waiting list initiatives, all non-pensionable pay. But you'll also need to include in this value any other amounts that you earn as taxable earnings. So for example, that could include income from interest or from property or from private practice or from dividend income. And unlike the situation for income tax, where you might get a tax-free dividend allowance, all of that income needs to be included for this non-pensionable pay, because that's what's included for the calculation of so-called threshold and adjusted income, which I'll talk about in subsequent videos. So moving on to the final section of this tab, which is section C, or the future. Now obviously, to be able to model your pension and taxation into the future, the model needs to have some understanding of how your pension will change. And your pension is dependent principally on your pensionable pay and of course your non-pensionable pay because of tapering. Now we've already discussed that if you have this set to consultant, it will automatically pull your pay increments dependent on which consultant pay scale you're on, and then this will automatically come through to here. So for example, I can see that this consultant will receive their next increment in 2021 age 43, and then also in 2026 age 48, based on the date of birth that they've put in and their consultant start date. And so I can see that that's come through to here. So I've got this increment here at 2026 and then again at 2031. If we want to turn those off and put them in manually because you're not on routine increments and perhaps started at a different point in the pay scale and can't automate that, that's absolutely fine. But this also allows you the opportunity to put in other changes. So for example, let's say you took on a pensionable management allowance for an additional £10,000. You could put that in this cell here. And then that would increase your pensionable pay from the tax year starting 2020, and that would carry on in perpetuity until you stopped it. So let's say you had that role for 5 or 6 years and then wanted to take that away, you would just simply put minus £10,000, and then that would accurately reflect that within your pensionable pay. So it would have gone up there, stayed there for 5 years and then gone away. You can put in other changes. For example, if you're doing a salary sacrifice arrangement for a lease car, you'd put in a negative value at the start and then a positive value at the end. And you should do your sums very carefully before entering into a large salary sacrifice arrangement, because the rules changed, and you could be left with a very nasty bill at the end when you give it back. And similarly, it's crucially important that the model understands how your non-pensionable pay is going to change. So by default, it will just pull your non-pensionable pay from the last tax year that you've put in. But if you're going to change the amount that you work, either more or less, you can reflect those values in here to see the effect that would have on your pension and also taxation. And it's probably important to mention that these values for your future you can change in another tab on the Change Analyzer. So by default, we've got a non-pensionable pay of £50,000 here, and then that's copied that down. And if I just flick across to the Change Analyzer, once you press the Prep Analyzer button, that essentially moves control from the initial step 1 to this model here, and then allows you to change that value on this cell here. So for example, if I change that to 40,000, and then if I go back to minimum data set, it should have then updated those values to £40,000, because that's just another place that you can model changes to your working practice. But ultimately it uses the values that are on this spreadsheet. So that completes the description for step 1 of minimum data set. Thank you very much.